Since you're watching this video, you're obviously an internet pro. Have you ever wondered how it actually works though? What's the deal with the HTTP portion in URLs? What actually happens when you click on a link? HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. Simply put, this is the protocol that allows us to communicate over the internet. We'll see a concrete example shortly, but I think it's useful to have a basic understanding of how sending and receiving data over the web works. That being said, this isn't a deep dive into HTTP. It can be confusing and overwhelming for me too, so don't worry if you also feel under the clouds with these concepts. The request-response model of computing powers the web. What this means is that we make a request to a certain place in a certain format. The place is accessed by an identifier, which we usually refer to as a URI, or Uniform Resource Identifier. Most commonly, with web pages, the URI is the web address, or URL. Notice the word address in web address. That's not an accident. The URL is like the address for a building. It's where you'll find the resource. I've included some information in the teacher's notes if you'd like to read more about URIs and URLs. We send a request to a specific location. The request is the first half of the process. The second half is the response from that location, or URI. This was the process we talked about previously when we discussed the Dark Sky API. This is a rather simplified discussion, which, for our purposes, is fine, as the details of how a network sends bytes and bits back and forth are abstracted away from us. Modern programming involves adding layers of abstraction. Each layer of abstraction makes it easier for us to concentrate on the higher level tasks we are concerned with. Prior to these levels of abstraction, we would have to worry about how to send the bits ourselves. That can be a real headache. Why is all of this important to us in our Stormy app? Well, we are getting ready to request some data from Dark Sky, and we do so with an HTTP GET request. Programming is truly about working with data that can be boiled down to 4 basic operations: creating data, reading or retrieving data once it's been created, updating the data, and deleting it. You will often hear these basic operations referred to by their acronym CRUD. HTTP has its own operations that correspond to this CRUD, as we see here. Most web programming primarily deals with 2 of these operations, POST and GET. Since we aren't creating a weather forecast with Stormy, we won't worry about the POST method. However, we will be using GET requests to retrieve or read data from a server. Whenever we visit a website, our browser issues an HTTP GET request to, well, request the latest version of the web page, video, weather forecast, or whatever it is we are wanting to view. I've put additional information in the teacher's notes about HTTP methods for further reading. Android clients are no different. We will be making an HTTP GET request to the Dark Sky API servers. Using the URI from the developer's documentation we previously looked at, we send a request with the exact information we want. The servers then send a response that includes the weather data. It's up to us then to handle the data we receive and use it in our application. If we use the web browser example, the server sends back a response with HTML and the browser converts it to a web page we can view. Recall that this is the power of the interface portion of the API in action. We don't need to know how Dark Sky gets their data, as long as we get back a response in an agreed-upon format. Sounds easy enough, right? Well, as you might have guessed, it isn't quite as simple as I've made it out to be. Sure, those basic concepts hold true, but we're going to have to learn how to create and send a web request, receive a response, and handle the response. We'll need to think about what happens if we get an error in the response as well. Additionally, we need to make sure we are performing these types of requests in the background to ensure our app remains responsive. Before we jump into our project again, let's discuss networking as it applies to mobile devices in the next video.